Rob Scott is with the Economic Policy Institute. He's the Director of Trade and Manufacturing Policy Research. His areas of expertise are international economics, trade and manufacturing policies, global finance, foreign investment and insourcing, and industry studies. This OMB Factoryless Goods Production Rule came out last month in the Federal Register, published by OMB. It would change the NAICS, or the NAICS, North American Industrial Classification System, in certain ways that Rob will describe. Rob, you can go ahead and put up your slideshow now.
Okay.
We do have the action item at the end will be to be aware that there is a July 21st deadline for comment at the Federal Register notice, or at OMB. There'll be an email that you'll see, and you'll get more information after this webinar that will also help if you want to make any comments. There is a question box. If you're on the computer and you see your GoToWebinar control panel, there's a question box. You can feel free during the webinar to type questions into it. When Rob is done, I will select questions. I probably won't get them afterward. All of them. We'll try to get to as many as we can. But we will add any questions to Rob and otherwise can be put in that question box, and we'll hold those to the end. With that, Rob, please proceed. Thank you and welcome.
Michael, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. Thanks for hosting today, and thanks to all the sponsors and to everybody on the call. I appreciate your patience. I'm sorry for the delay. I'm just getting up to speed on this technology. All right. Let me head into the production. Today I want to talk about what is known as factoryless goods production, and I want to talk to a controversy that's been begun to develop about this proposal, and to tell you how these proposed changes to government rules would, amongst other things, classify foreign goods as U.S. made. And I have to give you some background, talk about where these proposals came from and what they would do to U.S. Statistical systems and to various measures of U.S., in particular U.S. manufacturing production, because that's what this proposal is targeted at. It's targeted at manufacturing, production, and trade. It will also have big effects in the long run on trade in both goods and services, although I want to stress at the outset that the proposals on the trade side of the equation are, they have been put in place, but they have not been enacted yet for lack of the data needed to make this proposal happen. However, the proposal is no less threatening simply because they don't have the data needed to do what they want to do. So let's try and get a better understanding of what's been proposed, beginning with the first slide. I'll go there now. All right. Let's see if I can get my keyboard to respond. Sorry. It's always something. Now, hang on. Let me go to the slideshow. There we go. I want to talk about first the proposed updates to the NAICS. On May 22nd, the OMB solicited comments on their proposed revisions to the what's called the North American Industrial Classification System, or NAICS. As the slide says, NAICS was created in 1997 to unify industrial statistics for the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. Now, this is a notice of proposed rulemaking that's been issued by the OMB. The link to this rule is included in the first bullet there. I think we're going to make this available to all the presenters. I certainly can. If you haven't gotten it through other means, you can send me an email to rscott@epi.org, and I'll be happy to send you a copy of the presentation. with all of the links included. Comments are going to be due on this proposal by July 21st, 2014, and one of the most important things that we can do amongst all the participants in this call and all of the people that you're in contact with is to get comments to John Burns Murphy at census.gov at the address you see there. For further background on the proposal, you can see the report first issued by what's known as the Economic Policy Classification Committee, that's the ECPC, which outlines their recommendations for revisions to the NAICS. They made these recommendations back, I think, actually in around 2010, and yet they are still circulating the same set of proposed revisions. It was delayed once. It was supposed to take effect in 2012. It's now been delayed to 2017. It may be delayed yet again, and yet I think the statisticians are intent on seeing that this set of changes is incorporated into our trade and industrial statistics. And that is, I think, the most important underlying concern. The bottom line is this proposal would classify what are known as factoryless goods producers as manufacturers. And what I want to do in a moment is define for you what factoryless goods producers are. Now, I want to make sure, Michael, you think we've gotten through the introduction? Are you still on, Michael? I think he has his phone muted. So we'll go ahead, and if anybody has questions, feel free to type one in. I'll try and respond as they come along. If something that I say is not clear, go ahead and type it out. I'll keep an eye on the screen. Moving on to the next slide, looking at this concept of factoryless goods production. I'm going to first define some of the key terms that define what factoryless goods production is. Factoryless goods production has been developed in what's called response to what's called fragmented goods production, or otherwise known as the global value chain. It's a process through which multinationals have divided the production process up into pieces, which they can then parse out to producers in different countries. In addition, in a way to squeeze the absolute wage costs down to their absolute minimum. That's really what this fragmentation process has been about. It's minimizing the cost of production and putting downward pressure, especially on manufacturers' wage bills and other costs of production, but wages are the most important cost of production for most manufacturers. The census and the other committees involved, the other representatives are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or BEA. They propose three new categories of firms. First, an integrated manufacturer, or IM. An example would be a company like General Motors. Second, what's called a manufacturing service provider, a company that provides services to either an integrated manufacturer like GM or to the third category of producer, which I'll come to in a moment. Before I get there, an example of a manufacturing service provider is a company like Foxconn in China. Foxconn is the largest single employer in China, and it makes, amongst many other things, all of the electronic gadgets that Apple sells around the world, both in the US and elsewhere. The proposal from the census and their colleagues proposes to create this term now known as a factoryless goods producer, or FGP. An example of a factoryless food producer might be a company like Apple or Nike. At the moment, these firms, all they do is design, and they contract out 100% of their production to producers like Foxconn or to shoemaking companies in places like Bangladesh and Vietnam. These companies typically have no production workers at all. They're entirely engineers, designers, and marketers. And the goal of this proposed set of changes is to reclassify these firms, which are now treated as wholesale companies, to reclassify them as manufacturers. That has vast implications for our production and trade statistics. Now, in terms of why we're trying to do this and who's the motivation behind this kind of process, I think it's important to note as examples that the top 5 semiconductor firms in 2013, 5 of them were what are known as fabless manufacturing companies. These companies are names that you may know: Qualcomm, Broadcom, AMD, the maker of many computer chips that are competitors with Intel, MediaTek, and Vita. These are all big fabless semiconductor companies. None of them involved in any kind of their own production. All of it is done abroad by what are known as fabs, foreign fab manufacturers. These companies had total revenues of over $39 billion in 2013. This is a big business. But the question is it really manufacturing? And we'll get to the key issues about these FGP firms next. Top question, as I said, are these FGPs or factoryless goods producers, or as some like to call them, foreign good producers, really manufacturers? Another way that economists might ask this question is taking risks, and this is what Apple does when it produces a design for a new product, is taking a risk on the design the same thing as actually making a new product in your own factory. Here we might compare General Motors, which, at least in the past, used to do everything from making steel to producing and selling and financing motor vehicles, with a company like Apple. It does nothing but design the product and then market it through a set of retail stores around the country and on the internet. So the question is, are companies like Apple and Nike and AMD U.S. manufacturers? According to the Census and the Department of Labor and the BEA, they want to now call these companies manufacturers. What this would do is it would artificially inflate manufacturing employment and output, both nominal, that's measured in current dollars, and even more in real dollars. Why is it going to have a bigger impact on real than nominal? Well, as I said before, many of these factoryless goods producers are making computer equipment, and there is a problem with price deflators and computer equipment, and for the economists, we can talk about that later in Q&A. Suffice to say that there is a great deal of productivity growth in computer production, and this tends to lead to distortion in the amounts of real output of computer products. This problem has been known for many years. It will be expanded greatly if we accept this proposal. This proposal will also cook the books and hide the damage from U.S. trade and investment deals, free trade agreements like the FTP, and proposed transatlantic free trade agreements. This is going to, in the long run, it will change trade statistics. Now, I emphasize long run. Some of these changes won't take effect immediately, but if this proposal is accepted as written, the changes will take effect at some point down the road, and I'll show how and why in this talk. This proposal could also threaten Buy American provisions in the U.S. laws, Made in the USA requirements, could also threaten funding and in an important way, the legitimacy of the Export-Import Bank. It could give a tax break to outsourcers like Nike and Apple. As I said earlier, the trade threats are very real, but they're dormant for now. I think it's fair to say that they have set the stage, but they have not yet pulled that trigger. And this has led to some confusion in the debate about the FGP proposal. Some critics have said, oh, it's going to distort our trade statistics, and the economists have responded, oh, no, it really won't do that. And if you look closer, you find that, well, it might not do that next year or in 2017, but soon after, it will change U.S. trade statistics in very fundamental ways that we'll talk about here. The next couple of slides are summaries from the description circulated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. A woman there named Maureen Doherty, who has gone around in several presentations describing this proposal. She had some useful slides, which I've copied here, and we'll talk about them briefly. I also give you a link to her presentation at the end of this slide deck. How do statisticians respond to this process of fragmentation? As she noted, traditionally, everything involved in producing goods, everything in the production process was performed in one establishment or multiple establishments of the same firm, i.e. Ford or General Motors. However, because of changes in communications and technology, transportation processes, and because of global trade and foreign investment deals, and the explosion of foreign investment, which has grown much, much faster than output around the globe, this has allowed many of these steps to be performed in different locations, especially internationally. And now it's possible for a company or a single establishment in Palo Alto to control production around the world without actually making anything. This is what companies like Apple and Nike and AMD and the fabless semiconductor manufacturers do. The focus in these firms is on design and innovation and product distribution rather than on manufacturing, which is known as the volume production tasks involved in the production process. They don't have to worry about that. They just contract that to somebody else. So the question is, again, should that be included in manufacturing? And we'll talk about that again in just a couple slides. First, let's define some of these terms a little more carefully. As I mentioned, there are three new categories of firms that are going to be addressed in this proposal, that are addressed in this proposal. The first is, and by the way, this comes more from the detailed census description from 2012 that I referenced earlier than from the OMB outline. You won't get much in the way of details from the OMB outline. You have to go down to the census details if you want to find out what's being proposed here, and better yet, to these PowerPoints, which I'll direct you to at the end. So there are three types of establishments. There are integrated manufacturers like General Motors. They do everything involved, or most of the things involved in producing an actual good and taking all the risks of production. Then you have somebody new who's called a manufacturing service provider. This is a key participant in this process. This is, again, a company like Foxconn in China that performs all the production tasks, but it doesn't do any production management. Now, an important point to note here. These companies can purchase inputs, and this is an important point of contention amongst the statisticians. On the one hand, some of them want to include purchased inputs as what is as part of the services provided by the manufacturing service provider, and that's actually the broadest definition, the one of greatest risk. The narrow definition being promoted internationally says that these services performed by these companies only pertain to materials provided by the original factoryless goods producer, i.e. by Apple or by AMD. I'll talk about that again a little bit more later. Now that leads us next to the factoryless goods producer. This is what's gotten all the attention, but it's only one piece of this new set of lenses for looking at the manufacturing process. The factoryless goods producer does not transform goods and service, but they do perform production management. They may or they may not own the parts. Now, the statisticians, as I suggest here, have a choice. Where do they put these factoryless good producers and the manufacturing service providers that service them, and how do we count their output? Now, to a large extent, the FGPs are in wholesaling, and the manufacturing service providers, like Foxconn or similar firms in the United States, are counted as manufacturers, which makes a certain amount of sense. Those are the companies involved in actually producing goods and services. And when I'll come back to those MSPs in a moment. Now we have a choice. We can put them, put these firms in manufacturing only, put them in wholesale trade only, or we can split them based on either the location of the establishment or what it actually does. And this is what I don't list here, but this is the way it was, the presentation was made by Maureen Doherty from the BLS. She said that the choice is between location, whether it's domestic or foreign, but there are other choices. You could also categorize firms based on whether or not they're different kinds of service providers, professional, scientific, and technical, or they provide management services. Now, what do we choose to do? Well, there's a group called the Economic Policy Classification Committee. It's an intergovernmental committee. It involves representatives from Census, from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and from the Department of Labor, as well as the Fed. These are the big agencies involved in this decision. They decided as a committee that they're going to move factoryless goods producers into manufacturing. So in their proposal, Apple will become a manufacturer. And they have to ask the question, why manufacturing? Again, is taking risks the same thing as actually producing something? I would argue no. There's another way to handle this process of fragmentation. We could continue to do what we do today, and that would be an alternative choice. It wasn't a choice that was not given to us by the ECPC. They made the decision for us. Now, in their recommendation, various statistical agencies and programs are encouraged, they say, quote unquote, encouraged to collect sub-data on these three different types of quote unquote manufacturers. Integrated manufacturers, MSPs, FGPs. So in theory, going forward, we'll be able to track each of these different kinds of firms. But, and this is an important point, which I don't list on the slide, but in talking with these government statisticians, we asked, are the statistics going to be, that we have today, going to be maintained? The answer is no. Once we cross this Rubicon and we adopt the proposal to change the NAICS in the way that's been proposed, to move FGPs in manufacturing, it will change the definition of manufacturing forever. Again, the ECPC chose the broadest possible scope also for manufacturing service providers. The inputs they use will be counted as services, whether they're owned by the FGP or purchased by the manufacturing service provider. And this is important for trade, as I'll show up, as I show in the last few slides. Now, I want to look at the impacts of this proposal for NAICS revisions. It involves not just the FGP, but also the manufacturing service producers and so on. I want to look first at the domestic impacts, and then we'll turn to the trade side. This proposal will make no change, they say, in total U.S. employment or wages. Now, this is what, again, the BLS says, no change in employment or wages. I maintain it may have an impact on total U.S. output for reasons we'll see when we get to the trade section. They say there will be a shift. The value of production will shift from services, as you would imagine, from wholesaling into manufacturing. And what's going to happen? Manufacturing output will rise, will go up. Manufacturing employment will also rise. However, there's not any production that's going to be moved into manufacturing. There's going to be no increase in actual production in the manufacturing sector. All the production involved takes place someplace else. And so the number of production workers in manufacturing will not change. There'll be little, if any, change in production workers in manufacturing. As a result of this change in structure, we got a rise in the number of employed workers. Most of the people coming in will be designers and engineers who generally make higher wages than production workers. So as a result, the average level of manufacturing wages across all workers will increase. Now, given the nature of our labor statistics, we'll still be able to track separately the wages of production workers and all employees, but for the casual politician just looking at the manufacturing sector, they will see a rise in employment and a rise in wages, rise in output across the sector as a whole. It will look like manufacturing is getting healthy when nothing has changed at all. And that's important from a manufacturing policy point of view. Turning next to the international trade statistics, and this is where it gets really murky. And I've spent the better part of the past 2 to 3 weeks looking at the impact on international trade and listening to the comments of the various participants. And it simply takes a lot of sorting through the weeds to figure out what the impacts are going to be. One reason for that is because there are at least three different sets of trade standards and statistics that are in use, and the standards themselves are changing, not just here in the United States, but internationally, because this movement to treat what's called factoryless goods production differently is not just taking place in the United States. It's part of an international movement. Some might say an international conspiracy on the part of multinational organizations like the IMF and the OECD, as well as multinational companies, to change the way international accounting is done. And so we get changes in both U.S. trade statistics and international statistics going on at the same time, and there's an interaction in that process. So just briefly to try and summarize, there is a set of international merchandise trade statistics maintained by the United Nations. The link is provided there. This is framework, forms the framework for the U.S. Census trade statistics, which are based on, in part, what are known as HTS codes. Those census goods trade, at least in the short run, is not going to change, according to the statisticians. There will be no change in the census trade statistics. The second set of standards used is what's called the International Standard Industrial Classification, or ISIC. They have proposed their own method for dealing with what's called factoryless goods production. In the view of ISIC, legal ownership of the inputs used in production process is the basis for classification. So let's say that this is an example given by some of the economists we've heard talk about this in the last few weeks, specifically at the Washington International Trade Association seminar 2 weeks ago. Give an example of a semiconductor coming from AMD or Intel. If AMD owns the silicon, ships it to China, where it's turned into a semiconductor and it's shipped back under the ISIC standard and the proposed U.S. standards, trade in the semiconductor, in the silicon, would no longer count as part of U.S. trade. We wouldn't count the exports, we wouldn't count the imports. All we would count is the value of the manufacturing services provided in converting that chip into a semiconductor chip, an integrated circuit, or a transistor, if you will. So that's the standard that's proposed by ISIC, and it's also been adopted now by the United States in what are known as our balance of payments statistics. This is the balance of payments have been revised under the direction of the IMF. I provide a link there to the IMF statistical framework called the BPM6, or Balance of Payments Manual for number 6. This was the basis for a comprehensive restructuring. It was just announced last month by the BEA. They have announced now a comprehensive restructuring of U.S. international accounts. So the reason I went through all of this detailed statistical minutiae is to make the point that this train has left the station. We are already changing the way we're going to treat U.S. trade. We're going to treat trade by manufacturing service providers and factoryless goods producers differently than we had in the past. In the past, this process I prescribed of Intel shipping silicon abroad and having it turned into semiconductors, all of that trade would be counted as goods trade. In the future, some of that trade will not be counted at all, and the rest of it will become a service import. So we will have the phenomena of what used to be a goods trade deficit becoming a services import. That's going to affect the overall balance of services trade. And that's being driven not just by what's being proposed for NAICS, but by what's being proposed by the IMF and the U.S.'s comprehensive restructuring of its international accounts. That's the point I wanted to get across here. Now, how does this work? And I apologize, I'm going to go for maybe 2 more minutes into the weeds, and then we will, I'll try and wrap this up and take Q&A. Under these new U.S. international accounts, goods trade will closely follow this BPM-6 manual published by the IMF. Now, I provide a link here to the BEA's methodology that says this, and this page has a quote describing how they're going to treat imports and exports of goods. And the first bullet there is, or the second bullet there is a long quote from the new international accounts methodology section. It says how they're going to treat trade, and this is very different from the way trade is treated today. So under this this new BPM-6 treatment, goods are set abroad for processing without a change in ownership that are returned to the United States will be excluded from U.S. good trade statistics. There will be a processing fee charged by the foreign manufacturing service producer, which will be recorded as an import of U.S. import of services. In the same way, goods that enter the U.S. for processing without a change in ownership and are returned to the country of ownership, again, should be excluded from statistics on trade in goods. And the processing fees charged by U.S. manufacturing service providers should be recorded as U.S. exports of services. And in addition, goods produced from purchased from abroad by MSPs will be treated as a service import. Let me stress that again. If Foxconn buys displays and computer chips for your iPhone from producers in China or Germany or Korea and puts them into an iPhone and sends them here, that will no longer be counted as a goods import. You will no longer count 90% or more of the value of that phone as a goods import. It will become a services import. This is a way, in other words, to transship goods and convert them from what used to be goods imports under the current system of record keeping into a service import. This is going to fundamentally change our trade statistics. The NAICS proposal actually goes beyond, I'm sorry, there's a typo here. ISIS, it's actually ISIC. The NAICS proposal goes beyond ISIC. This is a quote. They rejected the ISIC decision to use legal ownership for classification, and this says why. But, and this is a key phrase here, but, and this is according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, lack of adequate data prevents BEA from introducing the new treatment at this time. Emphasis added. So, bottom line, a lot of the trade things that many people are worried about are not going to take place yet because the BEA simply doesn't have the data it needs to implement these proposed changes. But what I've tried to illustrate in this presentation today is that these changes are coming. And in fact, the NAICS proposal will make them worse because it includes all imports purchased by manufacturing service producers, not just things that are owned by companies like Intel or AMD or Apple. And it's going to have big impacts on our trade statistics, and it's going to get worse over time as the BEA is able to collect more data. So what is the bottom line here? In sum, where are we today? Some goods imports will be transformed eventually into services. For example, Apple's Foxconn imports. In addition, some of what these manufacturing service producers export to third countries will be counted as goods exports. As a result, the goods trade deficit will shrink, along with the services surplus. This will also introduce a form of what I haven't talked about yet today, but it is in fact value-added accounting. And this value-added approach will undermine enforcement of U.S. fair trade laws, for example, anti-dumping. And in order to see that, ask yourself the question, how do we value, what is the value of steel imported from China by a U.S. multinational from its plant in China? If there's a tariff on that steel for anti-dumping, how do we distinguish that from steel from a Chinese firm? And what duties will apply? Just a couple of quick summary slides, and then we'll be done. Just to summarize, as I mentioned at the beginning, regarding this NAICS proposal, the announcement from the Federal Reserve Board, comments are due by July 21st. You can email comments to john.burns.murphy@census.gov. I already mentioned the changes that have been made to the balance of payment statistics that were actually published in 2000, and that resulted in BEA introducing what is called its most significant change to international accounts since 1976. Again, to summarize, treatment of goods for processing is dormant, but BEA continues to research approaches to implementing this treatment. As I've said elsewhere, it's as though this plan is authorized, but the funds have not yet been appropriated. The last slide simply gives you references and sources. There was a key conference in March of 2013 organized by Upshaw and had lots of good papers on this. I've today summarized overviews by Maureen Doherty, which is linked there, and a PowerPoint by 3 economists from the Fed and the Census listed there. And these are all links to those presentations. With that, I will stop. Thank you for your patience and your attention. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. The action item to keep on your calendars is the July 21st deadline for comments. You'll see more guidance from CPA and other of the co-sponsors of this webinar about further interpreting and how we should be commenting and what to focus on to the extent you want to. Rob, there is a questions portion of your dashboard. If you can open that and make it bigger, you can choose the questions to ask or to answer. If you can't do that, I'm happy to do it myself.
Okay. Let me see if I can make that bigger. Yes. Okay. Audience question. The first question is, I hope we'll get a PDF version of the slideshow. And Michael, you said you are recording.
I answered that, Rob. Yep.
Okay, that's great. And I'm going to clean up the typos, and we'll get a final copy of this in PDF form. And let's see if there are other questions.
Do you see other questions there? If you don't see them, I'll start asking some from.
I do not see them. They're not on my screen. So if you would.
Okay, I'll proceed from here. We have, to the extent there's multiple questions from the same person, I'll try to be giving from different persons first. One from Stan Sorsher. GDP measures economic activity for all producers within the domestic economy. In GDP, we don't distinguish between foreign and domestic ownership or risk, just where the work is done. This proposal redefines GDP. Is that part of the discussion around this rule?
I have not seen discussion yet of the impacts of this change on GDP. I can imagine at the margin, if there are changes in measured imports and exports of services by, for example, Apple. One of the things they propose to do is when Foxconn exports a cell phone from China to a third country, let's say Europe or Japan, Apple is going to get a credit for the intellectual property contained in that cell phone. It's going to get a services export for that. So U.S. exports will increase. And since exports are one of the components of GDP, that should have an impact on GDP. Now, one could argue that those statistics should already be reflecting the value of all of Apple's exports to the world as a whole. I'm not convinced that's done accurately.
Okay, next question by Fariha Kamal of the Department of Commerce. Rob, aren't these concepts to be applied at the establishment level and not the firm level?
Very good question. Thank you, Fariha. Yes, that is exactly correct. These are establishment level concepts.
And does that change anything you said in the presentation?
I don't think it changes anything significant in the presentation, in the sense that we're going to be looking at transactions between establishments and we recategorizing ultimately. In the first case, we're going to be recategorizing workers. So workers, say, in Apple headquarters, where iPhones are designed and marketed, will be shifted into manufacturing. So that will increase U.S. manufacturing employment. That will be done establishment by establishment. All of U.S. manufacturing statistics are comprised of summaries of the activities at individual establishments. So that's where the data come from, and these changes will affect those data. Likewise, in terms of trade flows, changes, if and when they are ultimately the changes I've described are carried out, they will be reflected in trade, not just within establishments, but also at the border. And that's where they'll have their impact on U.S. trade statistics.
Next question is a Buy American related. Will American-owned companies now be able to get outsourced products from foreign factoryless good producers classified as American for Buy American procurement?
I think that's a serious concern. Owen Hernstedt we published a blog a few weeks ago by Owen Hernstedt on this topic, and that is one of his concerns. That what will happen is that, let's say, that iPhone that Apple produces is produced for Apple by Foxconn, is imported. That will be counted rather than as a goods import if and when the goods the trade statistics are changed. That will then be counted as a services import. And I am not sure how the Buy American provisions count the value of imported components. And it may or may not allow Apple to treat that, for example, as an American-made product. But I'm not, it could.
Next question, I'm going to combine two questions from the same person. Who's driving this from the private sector, and is there a chance of this being derailed?
I don't know yet who's driving it. It's clear that beneficiaries would include many large multinational companies. I've mentioned a number today: Apple, Nike, AMD, and so on, that would go from being wholesalers to being manufacturers. Now, I've been looking for benefits that they might obtain from being categorized as manufacturers. There aren't a great deal of special tax credits and so on that will be given to manufacturers. There are some, I think, some research credits for, for energy efficiency and so on. I think they may already be available to some of these firms. Maybe on the margin they get a few more benefits in that way. But they clearly are one interested party. I think it's important also to recognize that this is being driven by statisticians, not just in the United States. This is part of a broader international movement. I didn't have a chance to mention it. It's in my notes. But this proposal will, in effect, be based on value-added accounting. And value-added accounting is something that has been promoted by the World Trade Organization and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And those are large international organizations representing both economists and government officials, as well as, in many ways, multinational companies, and their interests through their advisory committees. And so I think those are the organizations that have been driving, for example, the revisions to the IMF's balance of payments manual that I've described here. And part of the interest of these groups is they have two specific interests. One is to undermine fair trade enforcement, such as anti-dumping and countervailing duty proceedings. As I mentioned, how do you assess duties if you now if identical goods can be valued on one hand as a service, on the other hand as a good, depending on who they're produced by in different countries. And if we go to value-added accounting, ultimately it's going to make it much more difficult to enforce fair trade laws. So I think that, and the other thing it does is it's going to suppress the value of U.S. goods trade statistics. That's, I think, explaining why is beyond us today, but I explained that in a paper I released here at EPI about a year and a half ago. I think it came out in February or so of 2013.
And
happy to provide it to anyone who's interested.
The second part of that question is any chance of this being derailed?
Good question. I think there's a lot of pushback. I think that, frankly, the agencies have been surprised by the pushback, and I think we have to be careful about not going overboard. I don't want to offend the people who are, seriously try to improve international statistics and manufacturing accounting. I don't think we have to. It's necessary to question their motivations here, but I think they may have been unaware of some of they may be dealing with some unintended consequences. Nonetheless, I think it's really important that a wide and a large number of people and a wide range of people share their views with the Census Bureau on this issue. The first time this was proposed, they received 10 comments. Not enough. The proposal was simply slowed down. If you want to, if you think this proposal needs to go back to the drawing board, they need to get a lot more than 10 comments.
Next question. If risk is the new defining characteristic of economic activity, then the financial industry would have been about $500 trillion in 2007. Shouldn't the FGP logic also apply to financial services?
That's a good one. I question whether or not risk is the most important defining characteristic of economic activity. I grant that that's what's being proposed here. They're equating risk-taking with actual production. There's a lot of genius involved in actual production that I think gets lost here in this new approach to productions and trade statistics.
Okay, next question. You mentioned there is pushback. From where is, who's pushing back? From where is the pushback coming?
I think that there's a lot of concern I've heard from people I've talked with in labor unions, people at CPA, other activists on trade and manufacturing. I think all of whom were surprised by this proposal. There was talk of this. I said there has been for some time. This is not a secret. The Upjohn conference was public, and it's been it's available on the internet. This took place in March of 2013. So we've known about this for some time. There was pushback before this was announced, and I think it was something of a surprise that the administration went ahead, despite the questions that had been raised, and announced this proposal and sent it out for comment.
Next question, then, sort of a gaming the system question. Couldn't manufacturers simply claim ownership of intermediate goods in artificial legal transactions so that almost any part of the value chain could be counted as domestic manufacturing?
I think so, but I think it's not. I think it's important not to be too hung up on this notion of ownership of intermediate goods. The way the NAICS proposal is drawn, it doesn't matter whether you own the goods or not. If it's been purchased by the manufacturing service provider and purchased abroad, and we're not talking about we're talking about trade now. If Foxconn, anything that Foxconn buys is going to be counted as a services import under the NAICS definition if the BEA is able to obtain the accounting data needed to implement the proposal.
Next question. If they are considered American manufacturers, then will their production overseas be regulated by EPA and OSHA?
Good question. I seriously doubt that. Most of our regulation stops at the border, and that's part of the problem.
Another question. The WTO, the head of the WTO, has expressed in the past irritation with country of origin labeling or rules of origin, saying products should be goods of the world. To what extent is that you've addressed it, but to what extent is the WTO and this whole goods of the world movement to make borders not matter part of this?
I think that's part of the underlying background. That's why I stress the relationship between this proposal and the proposal for value-added accounting, which is an initiative of the WTO and the OECD. It is an effort to blur the lines between domestic production and foreign production, and to eliminate those distinctions. And one of the things that value-added accounting will do is they will actually attempt to reconcile the trade statistics of, for example, the U.S. and China. The U.S. reports a much larger trade deficit with China than China reports in terms of a trade surplus with the United States. Some of that is outright deception. Some of it's differences in accounting procedures. For example, China counts exports to Hong Kong as going to Hong Kong, when in fact most of them get transshipped to the United States. So there's some of that involved, but some of it's also undercounting of exports. And what the WTO and OECD have proposed to do is, in effect, average the Chinese and the U.S. statistics. They're going to produce their own statistics that aren't based on any accounting of actual trade flows at all, but in fact, some sort of perhaps well-intentioned, desire simply to reduce the disparity in the international data, as though that should be an end goal in itself. But what it will do is, in fact, is hide the imbalances in global trade flows, and I think that simply does a disservice to producers everywhere.
Thank you, Rob. We're going to close the questions now. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to also say that next month we'll have our next in the series of monthly webinars. It will be on country of origin labeling, which is a U.S. domestic law applying to meat, seafood, and produce. It's been challenged by Canada and Mexico. It's been challenged by transnational food processors, both in the courts and via surrogate governments in the WTO forum. And we'll hear all the details of that, what's going on with the rule that currently exists, is currently impacting the labeling on your food, and what risks there are to that rule going away, or that labeling. And the presenter will be Bill Bullard, who's the CEO of RCAF USA, which is the second biggest cattle organization in the country. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors again. They are the Copper and Brass Fabricators Council, the New American Colonies in Colorado, the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the Rochester Technology and Manufacturing Association, the Dayton Region Manufacturers Association, NTMA Pittsburgh Chapter, SPIA Local 2001, the Tooling Manufacturing and Technologies Association, and WireNet. We appreciate their interest in this issue, their help in co-sponsoring, and look forward to working with them in the future too. So Rob, it was a great informative presentation. We will make the recording available. We'll put your PDF slides up on our website. within an hour or two as well, and people can, of course, request them directly. So thanks, everyone. We'll close now at 4 o'clock.